Thank you, Michael, so much for that introduction and really helping us connect the dots. Just to jump off what you said, I think too, what our presentation and the state of the voluntary carbon market report that we publish every year, tracking the state of the market for the previous year, looking sort of backwards. So we published our most recent report in May of 2025, and it looks back at what happened in the voluntary carbon market in 2024. But not only will this give you a state of the market and understanding of those key trends and developments and how the market is evolving, growing, and what direction it's going in, I think, bringing it back to it's important to the Cash Coalition, really helping to identify opportunities, understand more of those opportunities, but also challenges and just how the market functions. So we will be touching a little bit on 101 of the carbon market as well, for some of you that are less familiar with it. Ecosystem marketplace, as Michael said, has been around for 20 years. We've been publishing this report for 17 or 18, and we've really set out to increase, access to information about the voluntary carbon market, as well as really enhance understanding of what's happening in the market, because it's such a complex market, and it really depends on where you're entering it from and what type of stakeholder and actor you're in this space, which we'll touch on a little bit later. But there is a lot of complexity and nuance, and one key feature or element of this is to talk about pricing and how those price signals demonstrate what's happening in the market as well, in terms of different segments, how they're performing, what they indicate about the market. So with that, just to get a little bit into more of the details of what ecosystem marketplace is, Alex, if you want to maybe go to the next slide. We've already mentioned a little bit about this, but primarily what our data focuses on is that over-the-counter transaction data that's very hard to access. And we engage a really extensive, deep network of carbon market actors, predominantly from the supply side of the market. So the supply side are those who are generating the credits, managing projects to then sell on to intermediaries and end users to ultimately retire them to offset their emissions. But we focus on the supply side and all of those transactions that are happening to really get a better understanding of what's happening in the market. We also combine that with publicly available registry data, so that we are both giving a good picture of some of this harder to access information, and then publicly available registry data that gives us a bigger picture of sort of the life cycle of a carbon credit. So projects that are being registered, credits being issued, transactions, and then ultimately retirements. So I think with that, and then I guess one last thing to add is our data is available in a pretty dense and extensive report every year that's available on our website. I know Jonathan sent it around before we met, but you can also find it on ecosystemmarketplace.com. We also have a publicly available data platform that shares some of this market intelligence in a different format. It's interactive. You can click on certain things and understand an overview of the voluntary carbon market in terms of pricing, registry data. We have a database of projects on there. So there's a lot of information on there that I encourage you to access and play around with. I will send a link in the chat to that if anyone wants to explore it later. And the link is also here, and these slides will be posted after. So all of that will be accessible to you. But I think just in the interest of time, I'll hand it over to Alex to get started with some of our, with the presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Charlotte. So to start with, as Charlotte mentioned, we'll do sort of some level setting. If you're already pretty familiar with carbon markets, this might be feel more like review, but just wanted to make sure that everyone is on the same page, because often we speak to different stakeholders in this ecosystem, and some of them don't even realize how carbon markets work and how they act with them successfully. So what is a carbon credit and what is a carbon market? The carbon credit is an environmental finance instrument that represents 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide that was either prevented from being emitted into the atmosphere, which is a reduction project, or removed from the atmosphere, and that's a removal project. And what's important about these credits is that they're generated by projects. So we can call them project-based carbon credits. And those projects have specific attributes They are initiated in specific locations, and the finance from the carbon credits is essential for those project activities. That is the economic relationship that validates the concept of carbon credits. So the end users of credits, those are emitters, typically in the global north, who have more emissions than they're able to decarbonize in a certain time frame. And so they are essentially paying to fund projects all over the world, many of them concentrated in the global south, especially certain project categories that we'll discuss. And that's actually indicating a flow of finance for sustainable development activities, um, for for all sorts of activities that could be like changing forest and land management practices, introducing energy efficiency in industrial or in residential commercial spaces, um, sustainable development to sort of like leapfrog stages of development and avoid being trapped in a cycle of emissions. Um, and ultimately, that's claimed by the company that's actually trying to offset their emissions. So they're saying, I didn't reduce my emissions, but instead I funded a project somewhere else that reduced emissions or removed them from the atmosphere. So that's carbon credits. And you've probably heard of both the voluntary market and compliance carbon markets. So compliance carbon markets are those that are established by jurisdictions or industries to set specific targets and to help them reduce emissions to those targets. And they can actually generate credits um, essentially in the form of allowances, so like a cap and trade scheme. The voluntary carbon market is credits that are generated outside of those compliance mechanisms. So being generated by that project-based finance that I just discussed. But they can be used in some compliance markets, and that's one of the trends that we will dive deeper into for 2024. So when we talk about the voluntary carbon market, we generally refer to the origin of these credits coming from these project-based settings. So there are a lot of different actors who might want to engage with the voluntary carbon market. And so key are the project developers who actually organize the project activities on the ground, whether that's coordinating with communities to carry out a distributed program of activities, or whether that's working at a single industrial site for like a retrofit or installing new equipment. Then there are the end users who are actually using the credits to offset their emissions. A lot of that is large corporates, but we also see a lot of small and medium enterprises where, in order to establish like a leading strategy around sustainability, that they're actually engaging with carbon credits. A lot of institutions like universities and municipalities also feel called to engage in carbon markets in order to have an actionable plan to reduce their emissions. And then there's a lot of individuals who also want to purchase credits to offset their own emissions. There's also a diverse ecosystem that's reselling these credits. So not the originators, but rather traders, investors who get credits as part of their investment in a project, but don't intend to use them to offset their own emissions. And then aggregators who buy similar credits that have a set of attributes, bundle them, and then resell them for a markup to actors who have less sophistication to actually originate and purchase their own credits. Then outside of the actual folks who have a handle on the credits and take possession of the credits at some point in the life cycle of a carbon credit, then there's other stakeholders like national and multinational governments who are setting strategies to meet their nationally defined contributions under the Paris Agreement and keeping keeping both market-based solutions like carbon taxes and cap and trade schemes in mind, but also considering how exactly carbon credits can flow into those, and also how their strategy for the countries that tend to develop carbon credits in the global south, their strategy for marketing and for raising revenue off of the sales of those credits. Then we have multilaterals like the UNFCCC and the World Bank, who are actively involved with setting the rulebook for carbon markets, and for studying carbon markets and disseminating information on their impact globally, especially around sustainable development, which is a huge part of the voluntary carbon market. And so one big influence that we'll see with the UN in particular has been the advent of the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which is directly related to trading carbon credits. And then finally, I would say that there's a lot of NGOs who are directly or tangentially involved in this space. So many of them that actually develop their own carbon credits, but many more that are a partner to organizations that are developing carbon credits, and need to work with a local partner who has trust already on the ground. And so just really want to emphasize this notion of the flow of finance that is going towards climate mitigation and climate adaptation. And in the almost 20 years that we've been tracking this, there have been over $11.3 billion that have been invested in global carbon finance through the voluntary carbon market. So more just sort of mechanism of the market and how it functions. The supply of credits. So this is actually controlled by the standards, the organizations that define the types of projects that can issue credits. And so project developers request to initiate a project, they provide the proposal, and then standards are responsible for the independent evaluators who will actually confirm that the project as designed meets the standards of the methodology. They also are responsible for issuing the credits and then tracking retirements. And so the actual capacity of these standards can have a big impact on the supply of credits for specific project types. And then project developers often have a need for upfront capital when they're developing these projects, whereas they can't sell the credits until after there's been validation and verification through the standards, and through these organizations called VVB, validation verification bodies. So they often sign offtake agreements where they have a partner who agrees to provide funding up front, and then they are entitled to a certain value of credits once the credits are actually available to be sold. So that actually constrains the supply of credits in some situations where credits are pre-sold largely. In terms of demand in the carbon market, what we've seen in our research is that there's a lot of purchasing in the first and last quarter of the year, and this is because of the cycle of carbon accounting and reporting on emissions accounting that happens around the end of the year. And that's driving that purchasing to try and offset the last year's emissions. But intermediaries could buy at any time of the year, and particularly for certain project types like removal projects, we're seeing that there's a lot of demand at any time of year whenever those credits are available. And we'll dig into some of the specifics of these project categories as well. I want to keep it moving to some of the data slides. So we can see in terms of how the project registrations and credit issuances, it's controlled by registries, can cause a serious bottleneck in some project types, but it also shows the evolution of the carbon market. We see that since 2020, there's been a shift away from a lot of these renewable energy projects. A lot of those established under the legacy clean development mechanism that was part of the Kyoto Protocol. Now a big shift towards household and community devices, and continuing to see the importance of forestry and land use projects. So now getting into some of the key trends that we've been seeing in our research, as well as the work that we've done for the state of the voluntary carbon market for the last year. We're seeing a lot of demand for credits that have specific attributes that are either inherent to the project or the credits. So as I mentioned, credits that represent those carbon dioxide removals from the atmosphere have grown in prominence. There's also been increased demand for credits from a recent vintage. So we saw that in the last year, it went from a 50% premium on credits from the last 5 years. Now it's all the way up to 200% premium, where users are paying 3 times as much for credits that come from the last five years. There have been ongoing questions about the frameworks for claiming the voluntary offsetting. So considering that this all depends on end users who are going to claim these credits as offsets, their ability to actually claim those credibly is a big constraint on the overall demand in this market. But there's been more integration, also compliance markets providing new sources of demand, whether that's the CORSIA market for international aviation offsetting, the nascent Article 6 market that includes both bilateral trading as well as a mechanism that's going to be directly mediated by the UN, and then national and regional compliance markets, which have begun to accept some types of carbon credits. And then another key trend has been initiatives from within the voluntary carbon market around integrity and around increasing uptake. So from the supply side, that includes the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, who focus on instructing project developers around best practices for methodologies and carbon accounting. The Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, VCMI, which is focused on the demand side and raising awareness among end users on how to credibly claim offsets and avoid accusations of greenwashing. And then the Global Carbon Market Utility, which is focused on scaling carbon markets and increasing uptake. There have also been challenges, as Michael alluded to in his intro. There's been a ton of media criticism. I'm sure that some of you have seen some of that criticism. It's really, a lot of it has been centered on REDD+ projects, but sort of there's been a spread of the scrutiny of specific projects, spreads to scrutiny of project types, and then ultimately to scrutiny of the broader carbon market. And that's what a lot of these integrity initiatives have sprung up in response to. We also hear a lot from our respondents and from stakeholders that we work with about the lack of transparency that exists from market actors, whether that's at the level of project developers, the carbon standards and the data that they're actually able to share on the availability of new project types, the timeline for developing new project types and transitioning over to updated project types, and then integrity initiatives and the roadmap for what they are rolling out. And then with this lack of transparency, we often see that there is a lag in the actual market response. So what we're talking about today might be seen in 2025, might be seen in 2026 in terms of impact in the market, but it will continue to play out over a prolonged time frame. And especially just given how long it can take to generate and actually issue these credits for some projects, there's a lot of incentives to not throw the baby out with the bathwater, and to continue to still have older vintage credits and older types of projects in the market, and they represent emissions reductions and removals that have taken place. So we'll dive a bit into the market overview from the State of the Voluntary Carbon Market report. So first, we looked at the overall market and the life cycle of a carbon credit. And this is a figure that illustrates both issuances and retirements of credits. So that's by project developers and by end users who retire them in the dark orange, issuances being in the light orange. And then we also have the middle stage, which is transactions. So the carbon credit potentially passing through many hands, including aggregators, potentially being sold many years after they're being issued to an end user who will actually retire them. So that's why we see differences in the transaction volume and the issuance and retirement volume. But what we see is overall market activity peaked in 2021 and 2022 and has been steadily in decline as there's been a lot of consolidation in the market. At the same time, the overall demand has been steady since 2021 in the neighborhood of 180 to 200 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent credits that are retired each year. So in this regime where we have decreasing supply, but we have steady demand, we've seen price remain steady. And the price that we reported in 2024, an average of $6.34, was more than double the price that we saw for carbon credits in 2020. A lot of this is also down to the evolution of what is actually being sold in carbon markets and that push for integrity. So we'll see as we go into detail into some of these project categories, you're actually seeing those changes take place. The forestry land use category, which has been the largest category for the last several years by transaction volume, remains the largest category. We saw only a very slight decline, shows up as 0% when you round it to whole numbers, very small decline in the transaction volume. Whereas the second largest project type, renewable energy, continues to decline in transaction volume. Those are typically those older renewable energy projects using methodologies that have less rigorous carbon accounting, less clear additionality in terms of the project not taking place without carbon finance. So that shows that forestry land use has actually grown, takes up a larger and larger market share within the voluntary carbon market. Another category I'd like to highlight is waste disposal. We saw a transaction volume there more than triple in 2024, and that was really driven by the acceptance of landfill gas destruction and utilization projects in the ICVCM core carbon principles that led to a lot more investment in those waste disposal projects. So we're now seeing some project types that have been perceived as less glamorous, less interesting, are now being embraced because of their really solid carbon accounting. And that's leading them to have better marks for integrity. So we can come back to this later if there's any questions about specific project types. I wanted to highlight for nature-based projects and for forestry and land use projects, which we have a lot of network with these project developers at Forest Trends, given the overall nonprofit's position in the market. Also, I think very relevant to Cash Coalition and the work that you all do. So I wanted to present on this. We're still seeing REDD+, which is reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, and includes a variety of project activities that can be aimed at both increasing biomass and conserving existing forest land, preventing conversion and degradation. That, even though there's been a lot of scrutiny of this project type, it is still the largest project type within the voluntary carbon market by volume. We do continue to see prices decline for REDD+, but overall, that's also largely in sync with a movement towards removal credits. So we're seeing increased prices for afforestation, reforestation credits, increased prices for agroforestry credits, and increased prices for blue carbon credits. And these are all project types that actually involve growing new vegetation, so increasing the amount of biomass and drawing down carbon from the atmosphere to sequester it in that biomass. even though the supply of afforestation or reforestation, which is the most prominent type of removal credit, even though that supply is constrained, we're still seeing a lot of demand for that. So I'm actually seeing basically all of those credits get bought up, and that drove a 19% increase in the price of those credits. And then one more thing I'd like to note is the huge increase in the volume of improved forest management credits that were sold in the last year. So that more than tripled. And these tend to be projects that are all around the world, not just restricted to the locations that have been traditionally used for REDD+ projects. So we have some data on project location. And this is all, again, really explored in the report in much more depth. But over the last year, price declines were driven largely by projects in Asia. And that's really driven, when we looked at it more closely, by the decline in the price of renewable energy projects in Asia. So again, a lot of those legacy projects, many of them developed under the Clean Development Mechanism, without the standards for additionality, without the environmental and social safeguards in place that we see today for new projects that are developed under the most recent methodologies. Otherwise, we're actually seeing growth in a lot of places, especially in the global north, in North America, in Europe. So even though this is the location where a lot of the end users of credits are, there are also potential projects that can be developed in North America and in Europe. So this is a lot of the same material that I've just spoken to. We're also seeing that there's been some shifts in project standards. So ACR actually has grown in prominence, become the second largest standard. The VCS standard that's published by Barber remains the largest standard in the carbon market. But the main standards still are VCS, ACR, gold standard, and CAR. The CDM mechanism, there's still actually a large number of transactions of these credits, but it's obviously not possible to develop any projects under this. And we'll be discussing some of the questions about the transition of these projects to the new credit mechanism under Article 6.4. And pass it back to Charlotte to discuss some of the findings that we have found around the core carbon principles, before we return to sort of some of the general trends in the carbon market and move to more discussion.
Great. Thanks, Alex. And, we'll leave time, as you said, at the end for discussion, but we can flip back to different slides, because I know there's a lot of dense data and a lot to look at in these slides, which will also be posted later, and we're happy to answer questions after the fact. So with that, just quickly to preface this a bit, as Alex mentioned, a lot of carbon credits have some inherent project attributes that are indicators of quality. So we talked about it being a removal credit or the recency of its vintage in terms of when the credit was issued. There's also third-party initiatives such as ICVCM, the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets initiative of the Core Carbon Principles program, which has a set of standards and evaluates different project methodologies on whether they have integrity or not. And this is seen as a huge and very important development in the carbon market at this time, as there has been a lot of scrutiny on the quality and integrity of carbon credits. So having a third party come in and help evaluate different methodologies and approve certain methodologies, this is helpful guidance for the supply side to develop these new credits, but also for the demand and buyers to de-risk some of their purchasing choices by having this third-party verification on what is considered a quality or integrity credit. So with that, Alex, yes, thank you. So as of August 2025, ICVCM has evaluated 10 different 10 different methodologies from, or excuse me, 10 different project categories with different methodologies. There's a few in here that are different, but that is landfill gas, ozone depleting substances destruction, fugitive emissions, adipic acid, biochar, RED+, ARR, IFM, cook stoves, and biodigesters. So actually biochar and IFM was just approved earlier this week. So there's still some clarity and information that we're sort of gathering on what that means. But ICVCM is evaluating different methodologies on an ongoing basis. You can go to their website and see what they're reviewing, what they're assessing, if they've approved it or not. And there's a lot more detail on their process on their website. But some of, this is a sort of early in the implementation and rollout of these CCP approved credits. And so we're still waiting for assessments on project categories like, or methodologies like sustainable agriculture that I think are very relevant to smallholders. So with that, let's go to the next slide. Thank you, Alex. So RED+, the first methodology was approved under VM48. As of July, no projects have been registered or transitioned. So there's sort of two options within sort of rolling over projects into CCP approved methodologies. You either have an existing project that is under a different methodology and you can transition it to a new methodology that has been CC approved, and that has a lot to do with the carbon counting and baselines that are present within the project in the methodology, or you can register a new project. So you don't have an existing project and you register a new project and develop a new project with this new methodology from the start. So just to keep in mind this, as Alex mentioned, in terms of lags in the market, it takes time to develop projects, get it verified, grow those trees or whatever it may be. And so we will definitely see a lag in the supply responding to this development in the market as project developers undertake transitioning or registering new projects to the CCP program. There's also 2 jurisdictional RED methodologies that have been approved. So this is also important in terms of sort of the expanding interoperability between different markets and government sort of investing in climate mitigation. As Alex mentioned, RED still remains the biggest project category, but we are seeing declines, and I think we're just seeing a bit of sort of coalescing within this project category on what are sort of quality projects that will move forward, and some of the ones that received scrutiny for different reasons. Then there's aforestry, reforestry methodologies that have been approved. Excuse me, I said afforestation, reforestation, revegetation. Excuse me. The VM48, and then an ACR, afforestation, reforestation of degraded lands that was just approved recently. So again, CCP approvals will have a huge impact on the supply and both demand factors and dynamics of these credits. But with AR specifically and IFM as well, they're already in high demand. And we've seen those transaction volumes increase over the last year. So while they're already in demand, CCP will just increase the demand and impact the supply of those credits available. Then with IFM, as I mentioned, that was just approved this week. And a few different methodologies for IFM were approved with ACR, CAR, Climate Action Reserve, and under Vera. Again, it's really important to understand the demand impacts of CCP approval on credits and how it'll also affect, if there's constrained supply, what that means for demand, or just in general, what that means for price dynamics. So with that, let's keep moving, just because I want to leave us enough time. So one of the other things that Ecosystem Marketplace does, in addition to ask our partners and respondents to disclose their proprietary transaction data to us, is we also survey them and do sentiment surveys. So we have that quantitative data from them, that's pricing, and then we also survey them and track qualitative sentiments around why they think their portfolio and their projects are performing or not in the ways that we start to see year over year. So we did a follow-up survey specifically around demand signals and CCP after in June, after we published the latest state of VCM, and we had 75 responses to that. That predominantly, again, made up of product developers. So Alex, let's keep moving to the next one, please. So some of the findings from that survey, from the perspective, again, of the supply side, are what are the biggest bottlenecks for project development, credit issuances, and sales? And, if you look to the left here, the blue and the red and the green bars, there's a lot of bottlenecks from, a lack of clarity, delayed project validation, and internal bottlenecks from the supplier. So the first two, you really see that sort of partnership and collaboration needed between registries and project developers, sometimes delaying an ability for a project to be, issuing credits and made available. Then in terms of internal bottlenecks from the buyer and length of buyer due diligence process, again, this plays back into the education and the complexity of voluntary carbon markets, where buyers, are really trying to understand their purchasing decisions and also make sure that they have, the coverage and aren't overexposing themselves to criticism based on the types of projects that they're buying and their reasons behind it. And those are sort of the main reasons. And then moving on to their perceptions of the most important factors affecting buyer demand for these credits, which again is from the supply side. So market actors who are selling the credits, how they perceive the buyers that they're working with as, what are the biggest factors that influence their buying decisions. And so again, on the left, these first three are very much inherent to the project itself, right? So a buyer is first going out and selecting a project based on knowing what project type they want. They want, a certain category. They have a certain location in mind where they want this credit to be originated in. So that is predominantly a region. Obviously they may have a specific country in mind, but they want to transact or purchase from Asia or Africa or Latin America and Caribbean. And that has a lot to also do with their business as well, in terms of maybe where their supply chains are or some of their customers, et cetera. It can really vary. And then vintage as well, how recent the credit is. And then the sort of second tier that informs the decision-making of buyers is a lot on, these indicators around quality and integrity. So, a lot of buyers use credit ratings agencies that are third-party ratings agencies to help them navigate what are quality credits, whether they're eligible for compliance markets, which again strengthens really the demand for these credits, and compliance markets have much stricter guidelines around what credits you can transact. So another layer of due diligence, so to speak. And then again, core carbon principles, I think we'll continue to see that rise as something that's very prominent for buyers of if they're able to purchase a credit with CCP approval. Let's keep moving. And then just in terms of this survey and the perspective of respondents and how impactful CCP will be, 63% viewed it positively. We also were trying to really measure of the respondents who responded to us, who's really planning to transition. Again, going back to transparency and understanding what's happening in the carbon market, this is a new development, and there's a lack of clarity around who actually plans to undertake registering a new project or transitioning a new project. So we were really trying to measure of those who responded to us who had plans to do so, and quite a few did. So we had 29 respondents considering transitioning transitioning existing projects, and then 29 considering establishing new projects. So, it's a substantial number of project developers that are, really pursuing and in some ways pioneering early implementation of CCP approved methodologies. That said, I think, many respondents expressed that the pace of approvals is out of step with expectations of the larger VCM, meaning, going back to that lag of now that CCP or ICVCM has started rolling out these assessments, the demand side of the market is really expecting to be able to purchase and snap up a lot of these credits. Again, it's going to take time for the supply side of the market to transition to having CCP approved credits ready for purchase. So I think we'll keep moving just in the interest of time. Alex, if you could go to the next slide. So yeah, just to sort of set the scene a little bit and identify what to look out for, and then also facilitate a bit of a conversation here where you can ask, your questions to us. But some things that we're looking to in 2020, the rest of 2025, 2026, and into the future of the voluntary carbon market is, how those integrity frameworks continue to develop for the buy and sell side. So, the prominence of CCP approved credits and other initiatives that are really trying to help guide buyers and sellers to a market that has more integrity and quality projects. Again, we'll look at how we're establishing best practices around credit vintage, durability, also examining the role of reductions versus removals. This has been a big conversation over the last several years where there's a price premium for removals and also a preference for them, but reductions are still important and have climate mitigation outcomes. So we shouldn't just sort of dismiss them as not impactful. And then some of the market segments we're watching are agriculture and agroforestry, blue carbon, household and community devices, waste disposal, biogas, and biogas renewable energy. One thing I'm just remembering that we didn't mention in terms of CCP approved credits is in our report, we were able to identify that for the waste disposal category, particularly landfill gas credits, that methodology was approved for CCP approval in July of 2024. So we were able to measure that the price of credits from pre-July 2024 to post-July 2024, once the credits were approved by CCP, that the price premium for those credits increased by 35%. So that was one of our early indicators that these credits will fetch a higher price, they will be in demand, and also that demand will also be affected by the available supply of credits, as well as the price. And then just looking to COP30 in Belém in Brazil this year, as it relates, there's a lot obviously that goes on at the COPs in terms of multilateral and bilateral negotiations. But what we'll really be looking at from the perspective of the voluntary carbon market is how Article 6 continues to be sort of implemented. At COP29 last year, it was there were significant developments in terms of Article 6.4 mechanism, which Alex mentioned is the Article 6 mechanism that allows bilateral trading, but is managed through a UN-managed mechanism called the Paris Agreement, Paris Agreement crediting mechanism. Excuse me. Yeah. There's a lot of abbreviations and acronyms in this space. But so we'll be looking at how that policy will be implemented and defined to continue helping countries trade and address their nationally determined contributions, as well as this interoperability between national carbon markets, registries, and governments. And then because COP will be in Brazil, where Brazil has been very much an example of working with communities and related to carbon finance. The Minister of Indigenous Peoples is very involved and is a partner of Forest Trends as well. I saw Deborah, my colleague on the call. Our Communities and Territorial Governance Initiative is based in Brazil, does a lot of really important work in Brazil, across Latin America and other regions as well. But this will be a really rich opportunity to put the focus on communities and Indigenous people and how important it is for these land stewards and communities living on the land itself to be involved in carbon finance as partners, as equals, really making sure that those benefit sharing mechanisms are strong and that communities are working with project developers in terms of that free, prior, informed consent and other important facets of working with communities as we develop these projects. Alex, anything I may have glossed over? I was just trying to go quick, but if there's anything you wanted to add on this slide. And then we can turn it to questions for, the last 30 or so minutes.
Yeah, no, I think this was great. I guess the only thing that I would add is like when we think about market segments that have seen are like maybe a little bit underloved. I don't want to say that they're underdeveloped because a lot of these segments have existed for a long time, but that are underloved, like blue carbon, household community devices has sort of started to see a lot more appreciation in the last few years. Like waste disposal, biogas, renewable energy. A lot of this is really about rather than going for the lowest hanging fruit, then what's the next step in terms of how do we transition away from an economy that's producing these emissions where waste is just sort of left to rot and produce more emissions, and then how can we make that work for us? So a lot of this is really harnessing like the potential of a circular economy, and has a lot of potential in like small scale settings as well. That's where I spoke to kind of leapfrogging stages of development, going beyond introducing polluting, introducing heavy industry, electrical grids with fossil fuel generation, and then just going straight to sort of a distributed energy economy.
And just one last thing to add on that in terms of how this relates to smallholders is the approval of IFM as well is really built to work with smallholders across agricultural lands. So in terms of opportunities available there, we've seen an explosion in improved forest management IFM credits over the last year, particularly, and it's a really great opportunity for smallholder potential project developers and those who are exploring pre-feasibility tests and things like that to think about that project category.
Yeah, and I would say also like a lot of agricultural wastes, like animal manure, but also wastes from processing. So things like sugar mills, like wastewater from sugar mills that can be fermented to provide biogas. So, I mean, just given that so many people around the world are living in close relation with agriculture, it's also directly related. So, yeah, with that, we want to take your questions and hopefully it's just thought provoking.